She had not planned to stay. That was the part she kept coming back to, in the weeks that followed, when the snow came down so thick she couldn't see the barn from the kitchen window. She had not planned to stay. She had planned to look, to decide, and if the man was what she feared, rough-handed and hard-mouthed, and looking at her the way some men looked at things they'd bought, she would get back on the eastbound train and figure out the rest from there. The notice had been small. 3 lines in the back of a Lutheran newsletter her neighbor Marta passed along. The paper already soft from handling. Carpenter, widower, 1 son, age 7, seeks woman of steady character for housekeeping and companionship. Write to Elias Crane, Harlow, Montana. She had written to him because she was 31 and had nothing left in Ohio that hadn't already been buried or sold. Her mother gone in the spring, the house gone to her mother's creditors 2 months later. The man she'd thought she might marry gone long before that, not dead, just gone, which in some ways was harder to put down. She had written to him because steady character was something she still had, even when she didn't have much else. The train pulled into Harlow just after noon. She was the second to last off. A woman with a baby took the last step ahead of her, and she followed and stood on the platform with her bag at her feet and looked at the town. It was smaller than she'd imagined. 1 main street, wood-fronted buildings, a water tower at the far end with Harlow painted on the side in letters that had started to peel. The mountains were close, closer than she expected, close enough to feel like a wall on the north side of the valley, still carrying snow on the upper ridges even in late April. She looked for him. He'd said in his last letter that he'd meet her at the platform. Brown coat, he wrote. I'll have the boy with me. She didn't see a boy. She saw a man standing at the edge of the platform, not walking toward her, just standing. He had a brown coat. He was watching her in the flat, measuring way of a man who was used to looking at things and deciding what they were worth. She picked up her bag and walked toward him. He didn't move until she stopped in front of him. Then he nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already concluded. You'd be her, he said. I would. His name was Elias Crane. He was taller than she expected and quieter than his letters, which hadn't been especially loud to begin with. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been set hard sometime years ago and never fully relaxed. His hands, when he took her bag without asking, were the hands of a man who built things, wide palms, knuckles that had been split and healed and split again. Boys at school, he said. Get him on the way out. She followed him to a wagon at the side of the street. He put her bag in the back without ceremony. She climbed up herself before he had a chance to decide whether to help her. They rode without talking for the first few minutes. The town thinned out quickly. A feed store, a church, a small school with a bell tower. And then they were on a dirt road, heading northwest toward the mountains. How far? She asked. 20 minutes, maybe 25 today. Road soft. She looked at the country they were moving through. Sage flats, a creek line marked by willows, a hawk riding a thermal high up above the ridge. The air smelled like cold earth and pine resin and something faintly metallic she couldn't name. The notice said 1 son, she said. That's right. How old was he when his mother passed? A pause. 3. She said nothing more about it. The school was a 1-room building set back from the road. The teacher, a young woman named Miss Aldred, who couldn't have been more than 22, brought the boy out herself, holding his hand. He was small for 7, with his father's dark hair and a look on his face like he'd been told to be polite and was working very hard at it. His name was George. George, his father said. This is the woman I wrote you about. Yes, sir. George looked at her. She looked at him. He had a small cut healing above his left eyebrow and ink stains on 3 fingers of his right hand. He was trying not to seem curious and failing. I'm glad to meet you, she told him. He nodded with great seriousness. Yes, ma'am. He climbed into the back of the wagon with her bag and sat with his hands folded and looked at the road behind them the whole way home. The house was larger than she expected. 2 stories, pine log, with a covered porch on the south side and a kitchen garden that had been put in recently. The soil still dark and turned. There was a workshop behind the house, bigger than the house itself, and she could hear, even from the wagon seat, the sound of something being planed. Then she realized it was only the wind in the pines. The workshop was quiet. Elias Crane carried her bag in and set it at the foot of the stairs. Room's the second door on the right, he said. George is across the hall. I'm at the end. She looked around the kitchen while he spoke. There was a good stove, newer than the house, and a long pine table that had been built by someone who knew what they were doing. The floor was swept. The windows had curtains, faded blue, and someone had hemmed them unevenly, which meant Elias Crane had done it himself, or George had tried. "I'll start supper," she said. He looked at her like he was recalibrating something. "I mean, if you'll tell me where things are," he showed her. The pantry was in better shape than she expected. Flour, salt pork, dried beans, canned tomatoes, a smoked ham hanging from a hook. She noted where he kept the lard, where the knives were, which burners on the stove ran hot. "I'll leave you to it," he said, and went out to the workshop. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. Then she put on her apron, which she'd kept at the top of her bag because she knew she'd need it first. And she started. George appeared in the kitchen doorway about 20 minutes later. "Papa says you don't have to make anything fancy." "I'm not making anything fancy. I'm making beans and cornbread." He came in and stood near the table in a way that suggested he wanted to be useful but didn't know how to offer. "You can stir the beans if you want," she said. He came over and took the spoon. He stirred with considerable attention, like the outcome mattered. "Did you have a good day at school?" she asked. "We did long division. Do you like it?" "Not especially," he said. Then, carefully, "Do you?" She almost smiled. "I used to be better at it than I am now. I'm out of practice." George nodded, like this was a reasonable answer. By the time Elias came in from the workshop, the beans were done and the cornbread was on the table. He washed at the basin outside, came in, looked at the table, and sat down without comment. George sat across from him. She took the chair at the side. They ate. Elias had 2 helpings of beans and didn't say anything about the food, which she was learning might be how he said something about the food. "Miss Aldred gave us a map of the territories today," George said. "We have to label the rivers." "Which rivers?" his father asked. "Missouri, Yellowstone, Columbia." "You know where those are?" "Mostly." Elias glanced at her without intention. She was looking at George. She looked back at her bowl. After dinner, George helped her carry the dishes to the basin and then went upstairs without being told. She could hear him moving around overhead, the creak of his chair, the particular sound of small boots being set down on a wood floor. Elias was still at the table. He had a cup of coffee in front of him, and he was looking at it. "The beans were fine," he said. She took that for what it was. "The ham's going to need to be used," she said. "If I do a pot on Friday, it'll last most of the week." "All right." She dried the last bowl and hung the cloth. "If you have work you need done," she said, "it's better to tell me straight. I don't work well off guessing." He looked up at her then, really looked, with a kind of attention she hadn't expected from him. "All right," he said again, but differently. She went upstairs and found her room. The bed was solid pine, made up with 2 quilts that smelled like cedar. There was a small window facing east. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the dark shape of the mountains against the last of the light. She had not planned to stay, but the mountains were still there, and the bed was solid, and somewhere down the hall a 7-year-old boy was doing his best with a map of rivers he'd never seen. She lay down in her clothes and slept. The first week was about learning the shape of things. The workshop was where Elias spent most of his time. He built furniture, chairs, tables, cabinets, bed frames, and he had more work than he could comfortably handle, which she gathered was a recent problem. A mill had opened 2 valleys over the year before, and the town had grown. People who'd been making do with camp furniture were suddenly ordering proper pieces. He was good at what he did. She could tell by the things already in the house. The table, the banister on the stairs, a china cabinet in the corner of the main room that was almost too fine for the building around it. He had a feeling for proportion that most men didn't think about. She learned when to bring him coffee and when to leave it on the porch rail and walk away. She learned that George ate everything except boiled cabbage and had a habit of reading at the table when he thought no one was looking. She learned that the stove ran hot on the left side, and the porch step second from the bottom had been repaired once and needed to be repaired again. She learned that Elias Crane did not talk much, but that when he did, he meant it. There was a woman in town who came to the house on Wednesday mornings. A widow named Harriet Vane, who'd been helping with laundry and mending since some time before George could remember. Harriet was 60 or close to it, with red hands and a direct way of looking at people that she seemed to have arrived at through long practice. "You're not what I expected," Harriet told her on the first Wednesday. "What did you expect?" Harriet considered. Someone more frightened. She wrung out a shirt and hung it without answering. "He's not a bad man," Harriet said. "He just doesn't know what to do with someone being kind to him. She was a good woman, but she was sick a long time before she died. He got used to managing on his own." She thought about that, about the curtains with the uneven hem, about the way George had folded his hands in the back of the wagon, being polite, managing. "The boy needs routine," she said. It was not quite a question. "The boy needs someone who's going to stay," Harriet said. The snow came early that year. The first real snow arrived in the second week of October, which Harriet said was not unusual but was not ideal either. She woke to it at first light, the quality of the silence before she opened her eyes, and then the light through the east window coming in blue-white instead of the usual gray. George was already up. She could hear him in the kitchen, moving around with his particular energy of a child trying to be quiet. She dressed and went down. He was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the yard, his breath making a small fog on the glass. "School will be closed," he said when he heard her on the stairs. "Probably. Papa's already out." She looked. Through the window she could see the lamp in the workshop, yellow against the white, and a track of footprints crossing from the house. "He go out early?" "He always goes out early." George said it without complaint, just information. She made oatmeal. George ate it at the window, watching the snow come down. "Will you teach me long division?" he asked. "I thought you didn't like it." "I don't. But Miss Aldred says I have to get better at it before November." She brought her bowl to the window and they stood there together, going through problems on a piece of paper while the snow came down. He was better at it than he'd let on. Elias came in around 9 for coffee. He stood at the door and knocked the snow off his boots and looked at them both. George with the paper, her leaning over to check his work. He didn't say anything. He got his coffee and went back out. But that evening at supper, he asked George what they'd worked on. George explained long division with more enthusiasm than he'd shown for anything else all week. Elias listened. He asked 1 or 2 questions that showed he understood what George was telling him. When George went upstairs, Elias sat with his coffee again. "He doesn't usually talk that much at supper," he said. "He talked," she said. "You asked." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. She recognized it now as a thing he did when he was thinking. "I don't always know what to ask him." "He likes rivers," she said, "and long division, apparently, when no one is watching. He wanted to know what I thought of the Rocky Mountains this morning." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I thought they were the biggest thing I'd ever seen that wasn't sky." Elias Crane looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at his cup. "That's a good answer," he said. "The hard part came in November. There was a man named Durwood Pell who came to the workshop on a Thursday afternoon. She was in the kitchen garden, turning the dead plants into the soil before the ground froze hard, and she could hear them. Not the words, but the tone. Pell's voice was the kind that carried even when it wasn't trying to. When Pell left, she went inside and started on the bread she'd been planning for 2 days. She was shaping the loaves when Elias came in. He stood at the basin and washed his hands. He dried them. He didn't say anything. "Bread'll be ready by supper," she said. "All right." He sat at the table. She put the loaves in the oven and didn't look at him. "He wants the cedar cabinet back," Elias said finally. "Who does, Pell? He commissioned it 6 months ago. Now he's saying I built it wrong. Proportions are off, he says." She waited. "They're not off. I built it to the measurements he gave me." He looked at his hands. He knows that. He's looking for a way not to pay. She thought about the cabinet she'd seen him finishing last week, the careful dovetail joints, the way he'd run his hand along the top to check the level. 3 weeks' work at least. "Is that common?" she asked. "Common enough." He said it flat. "Less common when a man has a reputation long enough to push back. I'm not there yet." She looked at him. He was looking at the table. "Can you sell it to someone else? It's built to his measurements? Could it be adapted?" He looked up. "The proportions," she said. "If they're only slightly off from what someone else might want, a man who does smaller rooms, say, could you adjust it? Add a piece at the base, change out the upper section?" He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it. The upper molding could come off, he said. Replace it with something plainer. That'd bring it down a few inches in height. And the width? The width is fine for most rooms. Then it's not a loss, she said. It's a different customer. He looked at her for a long time. You think like a builder, he said. My father built fences for 30 years, she said. I learned early that a straight fence post can become a gate post if you change where you're standing. He stood up from the table. I'll look at the upper section tonight. After supper. After supper, he agreed. She turned back to the stove. She didn't let herself look at him leave. But she heard him, the pause at the door, the shift of his weight, and then the sound of the workshop door a minute later. December was cold in a way that felt serious. The temperature dropped in the second week and didn't come back up. She learned to keep the fire banked at night and to lay in extra wood before dark. George learned to check the stock tank in the morning, to break the ice before school. She and Elias developed a way of moving around each other that she thought of privately as choreography, not intimate, but deliberate. He knew when she would need the table clear. She knew when he would come in from the workshop, wanting quiet rather than conversation. George moved between them like a small satellite, belonging to both orbits. She found herself looking forward to evenings. That was the part she hadn't expected. After supper, when George went up to read or do his schoolwork, the kitchen grew quiet. Elias would stay at the table with his coffee. She would finish the dishes or do her mending. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. She told him once about her mother's house. The way it had smelled in summer, the particular sound of the gate latch. He listened without interrupting. He told her once about the winter George was born. How the snow had been so thick they couldn't get the doctor from town, and he'd done the whole thing himself, just him and his wife. And afterwards he'd sat in the kitchen for an hour because he didn't know what else to do, and he was afraid to move in case it all turned back. She didn't say anything for a little while after that. Then she said, "That must have been very quiet in this kitchen." "It was," he said. "It was very quiet." He turned his coffee cup. She finished the hem she was working on. One evening in the third week of December, she was coming down the stairs with a quilt she'd been intending to take to the chest in the main room. It was late. She'd lost track of time, mending upstairs by lamplight. The house was dark except for the kitchen, where the fire was still going. Elias was asleep at the table. His coffee cup was pushed to the side, and his head was on his folded arms, the way a man falls asleep when he didn't mean to. He had a piece of paper in front of him. Measurements for something. She could see the numbers and the careful sketch of a corner joint. She stood at the foot of the stairs. She had seen men sleeping before. Her father, the man she'd almost married. And there was something about the specific unguardedness of it, the way a person looked when they weren't trying to look like anything. Elias Crane asleep looked like a man who was tired all the way down. Like the tiredness was something he carried even in sleep, because he didn't know where to put it. She set the quilt over his shoulders. She didn't think about it. She just did it, the way you do something when your hands know what's needed before your head catches up. She went back upstairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the cold outside the window, the particular silence of a very cold night, which was not really silence at all, but the sound of everything contracted and still. She had not planned to stay. She was staying. Christmas was a small thing, which she had been expecting, and a warmer thing than she'd expected, which she had not. George made a paper chain for the mantel over 3 evenings, cutting and gluing with a focus she recognized from the long division mornings. He presented it to the room on the 23rd like he was conferring something official. "That's good work," Elias told him. George stood up a little straighter. She had brought some things from her mother's house. Not much. She couldn't bring much. But there was a small tin of cloves and one of nutmeg, and she made spiced cookies on the 24th that filled the house with a smell she hadn't smelled in 2 years. George ate 4 of them before supper and looked at her like she was something he'd found and didn't want to put back. On Christmas morning, she came downstairs to find Elias already at the table, which was not unusual. But in front of her place was a small folded piece of paper. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee. She unfolded it. It was a drawing. A careful, precise drawing done in pencil of a chest. Small cedar with a rounded lid and carved corner trim. Her name was written on the inside of the lid in his clear, deliberate hand, written the way a man writes something he doesn't intend to rub out. Not her first name, her full name. The way it looked on the letter she'd sent him 5 months ago from a house in Ohio that no longer existed. She folded it back. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. George looked between them with the interested neutrality of a child who understood that something was happening without understanding exactly what. "Can I have another cookie?" he asked. She laughed. She hadn't expected to. It came out simple and real, the kind of laugh that surprised the person doing the laughing. Elias looked at her then. Not the measuring look he'd given her on the train platform, not the careful look from across the supper table. Something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, or had a name she wasn't ready to put on it. "Get your cookie," she told George. He went. They were alone in the kitchen for the length of a few seconds. "I'll start it in January," Elias said. "When the other work eases." "Take your time," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." It was the first time she'd said it out loud. She heard it the way you hear something that was true before you said it. Already true, just waiting. He nodded. He turned his cup a quarter turn. But she thought, this time, that it wasn't thinking so much as it was something else, something settling. She got up to put the kettle on. The snow was coming down outside the kitchen window in the specific soft way it had when there was a lot more coming. George's paper chain looped across the mantel. The stove was hot. The house smelled like cloves. She had not planned to stay. But then, she thought, and not unhappily, no one ever planned the things that lasted.